Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, on any other day, today's spending plan would have been the big story at Westminster. The Chancellor, Sajid Javid, said he's turning the page on austerity as he promised to raise public spending by more than £13 billion next year. Extra funding has been announced for schools, defence and preparing for Britain's exit from the European Union. Our economics correspondent, Andy Verity, has been looking at the numbers. Andy.
Thanks very much, George. Well, just to get an idea of how unfamiliar we are with a boost to government spending like this, the last time spending rose this fast by more than 4% was back here in 2004. And the government was in a lot less debt back then. Now, these red bars here show the spending reviews since the financial crisis, when the government's debts shot up. They're all trying to slash public spending, also known as austerity. But Sajid Javid argues the interest rates on the government's debts are cheap now, so he can afford to borrow more for extra spending.
Every single government department has had its budget for day-to-day spending increased at least in line with inflation. That's what I mean by the end of austerity, Mr. Speaker. Britain's hard work paying off, our country living within its means, able to spend more on the things that matter.
Instead, we get this sham of a spending review. They're claiming to be against austerity after years of voting for it. Yep. They're claiming to be using headroom, which he knows has largely disappeared. And yet they're still failing to deliver a real end to austerity.
While spending on the NHS will rise by £6.2 billion next year, most of that isn't new money. It had already been announced by the previous Chancellor, Philip Hammond. But there is an extra £3 billion for schools and further education, a boost of £2.2 billion for the armed forces and £750 million for more police. That extra spending is affordable within the government's fiscal rules, but only if a no-deal Brexit doesn't happen.
Head teachers, chief constables and NHS managers simply can't rely on the Chancellor's fancy figures if Britain crashes out of the EU.
Absolutely.
Mr. Speaker, the independent watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility, said just 2 months ago that a no-deal Brexit would add £30 billion a year for the next 4 years to public borrowing.
The economy has already taken a hit, as we saw GDP contracting 0.2% in the second quarter of 2019. As Paul Johnson of the IFS put it in The Guardian, making big fiscal announcements in a period of great economic uncertainty means we will have little idea how sustainable or costly decisions made this week will be.
Now, adding to that uncertainty were figures out today that suggest the services sector barely grew in August, while manufacturing and construction shrank. We don't have the official figures yet, but there's a real possibility we may already be in recession. And that could make these spending plans look much less affordable.
Now, also today, we've heard that the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, is saying the impact of a no-deal Brexit on the UK economy would be less severe than previously thought. He said forecasts of how much the economy might shrink had been revised because of Brexit preparations since the end of last year. Our economics editor, Faisal Islam, is here. Just how significant do you think these comments from Mark Carney are?
So that phrase, less severe, means what it says on the tin. So it's moving in the right direction, but still far from comfortable. He also said, the Governor, that the economy was now only growing very weakly, and he waded into this debate, this political debate, about the impact of no deal on food prices, saying that although it could be worse, they could, under a no deal, go up by 5 to 6%. That's why the Chancellor has put £2 billion extra into no-deal preparations as part of the spending review for next year. But the other connection's also quite interesting. It was his predecessor, Philip Hammond, that set aside some extra borrowing capacity in order to deal with what he thought would be the consequences of a no-deal Brexit. That is what has been used to fund the extra public spending that we've just heard about.
All right, Faisal, thanks very much. Thank you.
Well, the other set-piece event in the Commons today was the Chancellor's spending review, which turned into a £13 billion government giveaway. Sajid Javid doled out cash to every department, declaring he was turning the page on austerity. Labour called it a piece of grubby electioneering and condemned Boris Johnson for heckling the shadow chancellor during his speech to the House. And no word on how those big spending plans will affect the deficit. Fatima Manji joins me from Abingdon Green. What's the Chancellor unveiled in today's spending round, Fatima?
Well, Jackie, actually took him a while to unveil anything. He spent the first 20 minutes of his statement talking about the Labour Party bashing their policies, talking about Brexit, talking about the backstop, talking about his bus driver dad. And he was actually reprimanded by the Speaker twice, who told him that he was out of order, that he needed to focus his remarks on the actual spending review. Now, that tells you that this is no ordinary spending statement. It's very much being seen as an election pitch by the Conservative Party and by the government. And it is quite a spending spree, the fastest spending by government in 15 years. Crucially, some of the areas that they're spending on are those that are important to Leave voters and important to those living in Labour constituencies. So perhaps it's no surprise that Labour called this a sham and grubby electioneering. But let's take a look at some of the numbers and the big winners in today's spending round. Funding for the NHS is set to go up by 3.1%. That's that crucial spending on hospitals. On schools too, that spending will be up by 3.9%. And the Home Office budget jumps up by 6.3%. Now that will cover the government's plan to recruit 20,000 extra police officers. So in fact, every department is set to get at least an increase in line with inflation. In the Chancellor's words, he said quite clearly, no department will be cut next year. That's what I mean by ending austerity. But here's the catch, because there's always a catch. Several people are pointing out that just because you're increasing spending, you're not actually reversing the cuts that have been taking place since the beginning of the coalition government in 2010. Let's just give you some examples here. The Home Office budget is still going to be 12% lower than it was in 2010. DEFRA, the Department for Food and Rural and Environment Agencies, their budget will still be 19% lower than in 2010. And spending at the Ministry of Justice is going to be 23% lower than the 2010 figure. One last very important figure, and that's more planning for Brexit, an extra £2 billion committed, bringing the total to £8.3 billion that he has planned for the Brexit preparations.
So the question is, where is all the money coming from?
Yes, key question, the money comes from more borrowing. The Chancellor says that that's OK because he believes that it falls within the previous government's fiscal rules to keep the deficit next year below 2% of national income. Now let's just remind you that Philip Hammond had kept back £26 billion of headroom for next year, what we might call a contingency fund, if you like. Now that sum was already due to be cut back by £12 billion because of a change in the way student loans are treated in the government's accounting. That would leave around £15 billion in the government's back pocket. But what we see today is that Sajid Javid has basically spent the lot. Now, he believes that that's sticking within the fiscal rules. We don't know what the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility says because they haven't actually released any documents today. But it's worth remembering that previous Chancellor George Osborne set up that office as an independent body to tell us the health of public finances because he believed, and many others agreed with him, that politicians can't be trusted to do so.
So what are the risks to this strategy from the Chancellor?
Look, politically it may well pay off to go into all this spending, but economically there is a problem. The deficit, we know that borrowing is already 60% higher than already. The economy is weak. We know that UK economic output shrank in the third quarter of this year, and if that continues, we'll go into a recession. Most importantly, though, we don't know what the Brexit plan looks like, and if we leave with no deal, the OBR has already suggested a no deal will hit the public finances. So the government's spending all this money without actually knowing what the economy looks like next year. Jackie.
Fatima, thanks very much. Well, go anywhere outside Westminster, and what most people want to know is how all this will affect their lives. Like, will the streets be any safer with more police on the beat? The Chancellor has promised £750 million to recruit thousands of new officers, but where will they all go? Now so many police stations have been closed, and might their resources be diverted to cope with any post-no-deal Brexit unrest? Our senior Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel has been out with the Merseyside Police, a force cut by 25% over the last 10 years.
So you're going to be deployed to an open land search, mate, to recover weapons, firearms, drugs and things like that.
88 officers, 2.5% of Merseyside Police's total, were today deployed on an operation to, in the force's words, sustain a hostile environment for organised crime. There was nothing covert about it. Visibility, they say, on the front line translates into public reassurance. So today was about road checks, weapon sweeps, search warrants, drug fines and arrests. In the background, county lines. In the foreground, recent shootings and knife attacks. This force has suffered more than most from the cuts. In 2010, Merseyside Police had more than 4,500 officers. In 2019, a decade later, that number stands at 3,400. That's a reduction of 25%. The force's detection rate is 1 in 6 cases. Overall crime levels have barely changed in the past year. Today's search warrant, though, proved worthwhile.
Just some of the items which are being recovered from in the house. We got sort of wraps of heroin. We got a wrap containing what looks like heroin and crack, a mixture.
Against that background, the Chancellor Sajid Javid today in his spending review announced what he said was the biggest rise in the Home Office budget for 15 years.
That means £750 million to fund the first year of our plan to recruit 20,000 new police officers. With an extra £45 million this year so that recruitment can start immediately.
Merseyside's slice of that cake, like every other force, has yet to be decided.
If you can't restore the numbers to the levels they were a decade ago, how bad will that be?
It's not a question of it being bad, really. I think we're far more efficient now than we were in 2010. We've made changes at first because we had to make changes, because we didn't have the finance to police the way we did. So if I get a proportion of those officers back, I will be happy. If I get all the officers back, I'll obviously be delighted, because we can do more. Because what I've missed over the last few years is the ability to be more proactive, to put criminals on the back foot.
But Brexit is also putting the forces on the back foot. Senior officers told the Home Affairs Select Committee that access to the EU's crime intelligence data could be a tiny fraction of what it is now after leaving, and no amount of recruiting will impact on that.
Well, the other business of the House of Commons today involved the Chancellor Sajid Javid setting out what sounded suspiciously like a pre-election giveaway. Even he called it turning the page on austerity. So government spending will go up by £13 billion, with schools, the health service and social care all getting more. In fact, every government department does.
Right, I want you to walk to the right.
In the age of austerity, this social care centre in Liverpool found itself sheltered from the storm. The City Council's budget has more than halved in 9 years. Services here have been protected, but elsewhere 2,500 council staff have been let go.
There's been cuts to every service right across the council, which is affecting the services that we get from people, the kind of support that they need from local authorities when it's necessary. So it's just really difficult.
The Chancellor of the Exchequer...
Enter a new Chancellor with a new agenda. Sajid Javid has announced the fastest increase in public spending for 15 years.
We are turning the page on austerity and beginning a new decade of renewal. A new economic era needs a new economic plan, and today we lay the foundations.
Next year, the government says it will spend almost £13.5 billion more than it previously planned. As expected, there's extra money for the NHS, schools, police and prisons. In real terms, the Department of Health, the Department for Education, the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice will see their budgets rise significantly. Spending on local government will also increase, with a £1 billion grant for adult and children's social care.
This is the end of austerity in the sense that all government departments are going to experience real terms budget increases next year, and that's something that many of them have not had over the past 8 years. But those increases next year won't go anywhere near reversing the cuts that many areas such as the Ministry of Justice and local government have seen since 2010.
Sajid Javid says he can afford to borrow more for public spending because the public finances are strong and the economy is growing. Except it's not clear the economy is growing, and things could take a turn for the worse in the event of a no-deal Brexit. Tonight, though, the Governor of the Bank of England said an abrupt departure from the EU would do less damage to the economy than the bank had previously suggested. In a letter to MPs, Mark Carney said improvements in preparedness mean that the appropriate set of assumptions to underpin a worst-case scenario would now be less severe. The bank now says in extremis the UK economy would contract by 5.5% in the event of no deal rather than 8%, although that's still a major recession.
Fix yourself back.
The cheques that the Chancellor has written today are probably good for a year, but beyond that, who knows? As ever, much depends on Brexit. Joel Hills, News at 10.